Qatar says it is suspending its mediation efforts to reach a ceasefire deal between Israel and the militant group Hamas. The Gulf Emirate has been a key player during the months of protracted diplomacy aimed at ending the Gaza war. But Qatar says negotiations have stalled and it won't return to the table unless both sides show they are serious about reaching a deal. The talks, also mediated by Egypt and the US, have repeatedly hit snags since a one-week truce last year. Qatar also says reports it intends to expel Hamas delegations in Doha are inaccurate. Well, Brian Katulis is the Senior Foreign Policy Analyst at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Good to see you, Brian. I wonder, as a starting point, is this the end of ceasefire negotiations for now between Israel and Hamas?
It certainly looks like it. These ceasefire talks have not really gone anywhere for quite some time. It's been almost a year since talks led to a ceasefire and a substantial hostage release. There was an effort about 6 months ago by President Joe Biden to try to restart it, but they didn't get much success. And then I think one thing that really has complicated things is the taking out of many Hamas leaders. Yahya Sinwar, others have actually fractured the movement and made it very difficult to get to a clear decision-making process in the terrorist group.
How important is or was Qatar as mediator in the Gaza war?
I mean, they were central there when more than 250 hostages were taken by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups. They were the first country that was on the speed dial of Israel and the United States. Egypt has helped out quite a lot too. But Qatar, I think, is central in part because since 2012, they've allowed Hamas's political leadership to have an office in Doha. And they've served as the key interlocutor, and they're the ones who we work with most closely, the United States and others, to try to understand what Hamas is doing.
Brian, in most negotiations, it's said that you need to know your walk-away point, the minimum value or outcome that you're willing to accept in a negotiation. Is it plausible to you that Qatar is near to reaching that point or has reached that point as a mediator?
Yeah, it looks like it, right? There's been tensions, I understand, between Qatar and Egypt, which is another key mediator here. But I think the simple fact of the matter is they're frustrated. The U.S. is frustrated because they set this goal of using diplomacy to try to get to an end to this war, at least a ceasefire. And the problem here is that you essentially have two combatants, Israel and Hamas, and what remains of Hamas's leadership, that don't accept the legitimacy of each other. They see this as a fight of an existential fight. So they're more inclined to use military means, terror, weapons, and things like this rather than diplomacy. So that's what makes it difficult. I feel really bad for the families of hostages because there's still dozens and dozens of hostages that are reportedly held by Hamas and other groups. And this is not a very good sign for them.
What do you make of reports that Qatar has not only stopped being a mediator, but has also asked or is considering asking Hamas to leave the country?
I understand that the Biden administration and others have been quietly saying that this should happen for several weeks now, since Hamas has not been very responsive to the negotiations. It also, maybe it's too early to tell, but I think the re-election of Donald Trump and his return to office in January, as well as a Republican-controlled Congress, may actually have the Qataris reading the tea leaves, because many in the Republican Party here in the United States have a much more hawkish view and are more skeptical about diplomacy with Hamas. So that may be another factor, too, that could be influencing how Qatar is posturing here.
And where could Hamas go if its leaders would have to leave Qatar?
I mean, there's any number of places they could go. They could go to Tehran. People forget that the leadership of al-Qaeda, after Osama bin Laden was killed, is basically based in Tehran, in Iran. Ankara or Istanbul in Turkey is another place that would be sympathetic, perhaps, to them. But compared to, say, 10 years ago, where there were more places where Islamists and terror groups could go, there's quite a lot less than that. You know, Egypt used to, for a brief period, be controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood. That's not an option right now. So there's not many places it can go. And I think, again, this is probably a consequence of the fracturing of a movement that's seen intense military pressure from Israel.
Finally, Brian, back to reading those tea leaves again. It's hard to ignore the prospect of Donald Trump and his effect on these negotiations between Hamas and Israel. What do you think will change from January under the new President, Donald Trump?
That's the big question everyone is asking here, because Trump quite often would say two different things at the same time on the same issue. On Iran, for instance, he would say that he would have a better deal and even bring them into the Abraham Accords. But at the same time, he privately encouraged Benjamin Netanyahu to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities when Israel retaliated last month for Iran's strike on Israel. So he's so unpredictable and prides himself in that unpredictability. I think one thing, though, is it's quite unlikely you'll see Donald Trump sitting down with the leadership of Hamas in the way that he did with North Korea's leadership and things like this. I think the pressure campaign through military means by Israel will likely be given much more of a blank check under Trump. And I think that will probably have even greater devastating consequences for the people of the Palestinian people of Gaza.
Brian, it's been great to get your input. Brian Katulis with the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you.